Hello, everybody. It is 3 p.m. So while people make their way into the webinar, I might get started. My name is Luke Menzel. I'm CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on electrification in buildings, where we are and where it's all going. I am standing today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand, and of course the many lands which all of you are joining us from today. I also want to acknowledge that this webinar is enabled by a partnership between the Energy Efficiency Council and the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water federally. We work with DQ, as it's affectionately known, to, I guess, leverage some of the partnerships that the federal government has in terms of collaboration internationally on energy performance in buildings and communities, and particularly the International Energy Agency's Energy in Buildings and Communities program. So from time to time, we run webinars like this, which puts a spotlight on latest research and insights from Australia and around the world. And today we're talking about a very hot topic, electrification in buildings. So a little bit of housekeeping. We've all done this a few times by now. We're living in a post-COVID world, so we know our way around a Zoom call, so I won't labour the point, but we will be having an extensive Q&A in the back half of this session. So as questions are occurring to you, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to circle back to them. We are recording this presentation, and so there'll be people that join us today and get the live experience. There'll be others that look forward to the message that we send out later on, and have the opportunity to catch up on YouTube later on. So if you're particularly impressed with what our speakers have to say, you can always pass that on in due course. In terms of the format, each speaker is going to give a shortish presentation, sharing some of their perspectives on this topic, and then we'll get into the panel. And the prompt for today's discussion is really just the huge amount of work that is taking place on this topic of electrification in buildings. It's running hot in the public debate. Public's increasingly up for a discussion around electrification. There's also increasing interest from government that is grappling with this issue, that is recognising that decarbonising heat load in buildings is on the critical path towards net zero by 2050, and something which is quite a big task. While we have a lot of the technology available to us to do that now, the upgrades to the millions of buildings around the country to enable that is going to take some time and effort and thought, both from a supply chain, skills, policy, and a range of different elements. But most importantly, it's how that effort interacts with our energy system. And so, we've obviously got very ambitious targets in terms of renewable penetration. You've got that new electric load that we need to accommodate on the system. And from our perspective at the Energy Efficiency Council, ensuring that we electrify efficiently, that we're aligning that new load to the degree that's possible with the availability of renewable generation is really critical to make sure that we do this transition as quickly and efficiently as we possibly can. And that gets us into a whole bunch of other topics, including thermal performance of buildings, which can make a big difference in how efficient that electrification journey is. So that's the broad prompt. The specific kind of drive for having this conversation right now is because there's been so much work happening in this space. Both the EEC and our friends at ASBEC and the Green Building Council, and in the research community right around the country, have been thinking deeply about this topic from a whole bunch of different angles, from a public policy perspective, from the practicalities of electrifying, from how this affects the most vulnerable in our community, and the social license for what is a very significant change in terms of building technology that touches millions and millions of homes around the country. There's so many different angles into this, and it seemed like a really good moment within 6 months of the release of a bunch of quite substantive reports to actually take a step back, reflect, understand what those reports said and what they mean for the pathway forward. So that's as much as I need to do in terms of a preamble. So with that, I'm going to ask our first presenter, Alison Scotland, the Executive Director of the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, joining us live from Italy, which is just how she rolls. Alison, if you wanted to unmute yourself and kick off your presentation, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you for having me. Pulling in from a very cold Italy, but I'm in a very lovely, thermally comfort house, so I'm feeling good at the moment. And thanks for having me, everyone. Lovely to be here. Just a quick intro, in case you're not aware of who ASBEC is. It stands for the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and what we are is a collaboration of key industry bodies in the built environment. And what we like to focus on is providing research and informing policy development in the sustainable building space. So we, oh yeah, you can go to the next slide, Nat, thanks. So one of, we like to focus on areas that we know are, priorities. And we noticed that a lot of the leaders in the built environment space were looking to fully decarbonise their building operations. And many of them were choosing electrification, but we wanted to do a research report to figure out in a technology agnostic way what type of technology is going to get there to fully decarbonise building operations the fastest and the cheapest. So that was our research project, and kindly financially supported by DECU and by the New South Wales government. So we carried out a range of technical and economic analysis using AEMO's integrated systems plan. Interestingly, we used, because of the project, we used the 2021 ISP, which really, that was before the war, Russia's war with Ukraine, before gas prices have increased across the country. So the results of this project are super conservative. But interestingly, our findings, even in a very conservative modelling capacity, show the pathway is electrification. So Nat, if you can move on to the next slide. We found in this modelling, we wanted it to be technology agnostic. So we used 3 plausible but divergent scenarios in this case. So obviously scenario 1 was 100% electrification. Scenario 2, we wanted to see what the results were like with a combination of electrification and green hydrogen. So that's hydrogen produced by renewable energy. And then scenario 3 was the base case modelled on AEMO's ISP. Moving on, thank you, Nat. What we found in the analysis, what we found in the current state was that gas use in Australia, both in a residential and commercial sectors, overwhelmingly, New South Wales and Victoria are our highest gas users. So that showed us where we might need to focus our policy attention. And then again, in both the commercial and resi space, overwhelmingly, the most common use of gas is in space heating, followed by water, hot water heating, and then by cooking. So that shows us, again, where we need to focus our attention. But interestingly, in terms of gas use, there was a lot of wastage in relation to the efficiency of gas use. So very rarely did we get over 60% of capacity when you're using your gas, a lot of that energy is wasted when using gas, especially for heating. In the commercial space, it showed, the analysis showed that it's the large commercial buildings that are the biggest gas users. So again, areas to focus on gas use. And again, Victoria was winning hands down in terms of commercial building gas use related to heating. So this focus on heating and gas boilers in commercial buildings, that's a big one. And again, residential using gas for space heating. So they were some really interesting findings that we had as part of the initial analysis. But then jumping to the conclusions, and Nat, if you can move on to the next slide. Unsurprisingly, our technological and economic modelling showed hands down that in every scenario, 100% electrification was the lowest cost and fastest emission reduction pathway. So, and remember, that's using the conservative modelling here. So it shows that if we put into place policy mechanisms to shift to electrification, it is going to get us to decarbonise buildings the fastest, and it'll save us a lot more money in the long run. So, if you're investing in gas infrastructure now, that is, you're going to have to replace that in a few years anyway. One key item to note that converting to electrification wasn't always a zero cost scenario. So that implies that there does need to be policy intervention in this space. And if you move on to the next screen, Nat, we came up, based on these findings, we came up with some high-level policy recommendations. And I know that my wonderful speakers later in this space will be delving further into these recommendations. But we came up with some high-level policy recommendations to ensure that the rollout of electrification is done in a planned way. One of the key considerations is the fact that in considering electrification, we are assuming that you have an efficient building to start with, because you are not going to have a good rollout of electrification until your buildings are thermally efficient beforehand, because that's going to save you the money in the long run. But there's a whole range of other policy interventions that need to occur, and you can see them up on the screen. And I know that Davina and Bruce will roll into this, and Nicola as well, later on in the space. So I might leave it there, and then we can delve further into these recommendations further on. Thank you, Luke.
Hey, thanks, Alison. Really good work that's been done by ASBEC, and just incredible engagement from the governments that helped to fund that work, New South Wales and the federal government, as well as all the ASBEC members that fit into it. But yes, as you say, we'll pick up that thread in the chat. It is now my great pleasure to hand over to my friend Davina Rooney, CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia, another organisation that has really been spearheading this conversation around the transition that we're seeing in the built environment, away from gas to electricity derived from renewables. And Davina, the Green Building Council has done a whole bunch of work in this space, including a couple of really interesting guides on electrification, both in new buildings and in existing buildings in the last 12 months. But there's a lot of other stuff going on as well, and I'm sure you're going to take us through it. Thanks, Davina.
Fantastic. Well, what a fabulous conversation for us all to have. So I thought with electrification, I would just start and give a little bit of a context of the why, and then talk about some of the things that we've been working on this space, and give a very brief overview that we will continue to unpack in discussion. So when you look at why electrification, when we look at the latest IPCC reports, as we know, we're affirming a lot of the same areas, the urgent need for the reductions of emissions, but we are actually seeing an incredible focus on methane. So a need for strong, rapid and sustained reductions in methane. Now, when we work at that with our international reports at a more granular level, and we start looking at the incredible work of the International Energy Agency of this space, what's fascinating is on the journey to 2050, there is now a prediction that electrification is actually going to have a bigger role in the built environment than energy efficiency. Now, as my friends at the Energy Efficiency Council or anyone on this webinar will tell you, we need to do that in lockstep with efficiency work to make sure that it's an effective transition. But what we're seeing is that this is an enormous issue that we absolutely need to be on the front foot of. And then the Climate Council, partnering with Asthma Australia, has done a substantive report on the health piece, drawing on many research studies that, to be frank, have been over 30 years, that kind of boil down to the effects of gas cooktops on asthma is similar to the impact of passive smoking for asthma implications. Now, the thing that we've got to be cognizant of is there's different parts of our community that hear different parts of the message differently. And, you know, when we look at things that make a difference, we've actually got to look at the policy space, but we absolutely need to be looking at hearts and minds in this space. So from the Green Building Council's work, there's been substantial work in setting climate positive pathways in this space. There's been work drafting that into detailed guidelines for Green Star buildings, and there's been work on global commitments in this space. But I think the thing that's interesting is we know what a net zero building looks like now. It's a highly efficient building powered by renewables that's fossil fuel free. So this electrification aspect, which is a large part of this discussion and absolutely zeroes in on the different ways that fossil gas is being used. Now, the thing that we all have to acknowledge is that when we look at the hydrogen ladder, there is a space, obviously, for green hydrogen in the critical areas like green steel. There's lots of opportunities in this space. You know, the fact is, when we look at the IEA and other leading global research, heating in buildings is not that pathway. And so the focus of today is talking about electrification of buildings as distinct to other, you know, potential green hydrogen applications. But I'm sure we'll unpack that further in the chat. One of the things to note when we talk about how we actually put pathways out as the Green Building Council, these highly efficient buildings, fossil fuel free, you know, powered by renewables, there's a requirement for all world leadership buildings to achieve that from 2020 for all new rating tools in Green Star buildings. We move that to 5-star Australian excellence buildings, then we move that into the entire rating system, and then we're advocating that that should move into the construction code and across all the different areas, and then setting a pathway of what that looks like for existing buildings, saying that really should be out at like 2040 as a transition pathway, and 2050 all buildings. You know, this is going to take a long time for this kind of transition, and that's why we're all advocating for policy levers, or many of you know I talk about the carrot, the stick and the tambourine. You know, it's going to take a requirement of voluntary, it's going to take, you know, regulatory levers like the National Construction Code that Alison mentioned earlier, but we all need to unpack how we actually look at community engagement, that very important tambourine. So we actually did some work last year, launching with our partners, the CookSafe Coalition, a campaign to have celebrity chefs like Neil Perry, Polissa Anderson and others, you know, come and give us the feedback that induction cooking is better, it's safer. Importantly, the kitchens are easier to clean. And we did a large consumer launch in that space. We had huge interest across all forms of print media, and TV had over 6 million potential viewership across the different media coverage, and have had substantial engagement in that space. One of the things that Luke asked me to cover, and I think we'll start to unpack this later in the webinar, is the Green Building Council's been saying, we'd love to do this in the consumer space. We'd like to talk about policy, but understandably, people are saying, great that we talk about it at a webinar, but what do I do tomorrow? How do I know where to start? And so we've put out 2 practical guides, a new buildings guide, an existing buildings guide, and we're currently drafting a precincts guide at the moment. And there's a bit of a thank you down there to our key partners who've been working with us on the first 2 guides, and we're very excited to keep going in this space. But for those of you on the call who this is, you know, who are new to this space, these guides exist to run you through what are the uses of gas in the built environment, what's the alternative, how do I do it? You know, they run through things like key cost savings for you and start to unpack, is it big dollars, is it small dollars, how do I plan that? Importantly, it gives elements like paybacks. We're excited to note in commercial kitchens, sorry, my apologies, the slides just had a moment there, but you know, we're looking at paybacks of around 2 to 3 years. So, you know, and that's, you know, as Alison noted, since we've done those calculations, well, North Sydney Council ran an excellent study in this area. Obviously, the Ukraine war has actually changed the paradigm for costs of gas. So these guides go from very high level to the kind of schematics that you discuss with your engineer. But, you know, a really common question that we're asked is, how do I go about starting to unpack existing buildings? So we do things like layout for people's options. People say the grid hasn't decarbonised yet. Why would I do it now? So we lay out the various scenarios to 2050 as emissions profiles when you start to look what they would, you know, what that would be. And then importantly for existing buildings, it's a plan that you do over time. So these are strategies where you review the systems, you have a plan, and you deliver them in stages, you know, ideally at the end of key capital cost replacement cycles is a fundamental time for us all to be looking at these things, but it really seeks to unpack these things. Really importantly for everyone on the call, it's got some case studies so you can learn the things that went well and have been really complex for others. And so I'm actually going to pause there, hand back to the wonderful Luke, and really look forward to unpacking these discussions. Really excited to start seeing a bunch of questions coming through the Q&A and a chat. All the presenters on here, we live for unpacking these as a discussion, so keep them coming. Thanks, Luke. Back to you.
Hey, thanks, Davina. Perfect segue to another part of the conversation. So we're now going to Dr. Nicola Willand from RMIT, and she's a senior lecturer in the School of Property, Construction and Project Management. And Nicola, I think it's fair to characterise your work as, you know, very interested in this transition, how we prosecute it, but you also note that, you know, when nerds like us get together, we tend to focus on the environmental and the outcomes and the technology. And you're here to remind us that there's people that live in all these buildings, but you need to bring them along for a journey. And in particular, we need to think about the most vulnerable in our community and how this sort of very significant transition is going to impact them, how we bring them along and make sure that they're not left behind. But I'll leave you to get into some of the detail around that.
Thank you, Luke. Yes, I'll look at the social considerations in the electrification of household energy services. I'll capture the diversity of householder values, challenges in ensuring that promised outcomes are achieved, and equity in the transition. So focus on technological solution often neglect to consider that dwellings, sort of that material entity, they actually have meanings. There are homes, and electricity is just one of many energy carriers. And householders apply varied criteria in judging energy in the home. So the electrification transition will only be deemed good, or people think it's valuable, if their quality of life is maintained or improved. And some of the criteria people do apply when they talk about the energy, for example, is reliability. Can I still make myself a cup of tea if there is a power outage? Some people say the open flame is a safety risk. Others say I can see the flame, so that makes it safer when I cook. When it comes to the pollution of gas fumes, few people know about it. But some householders also say that cooking on an open flame with gas is better for health, sort of inner health. And then there are practices around cooking on gas which really they need that very high heat. There are certain utensils that need gas. So people, those practices can be quite sticky. And then there's effective attachment to the home. New paint, new carpets, they might count for more than energy efficiency or solar panels, although solar panels seem to be quite popular. And then there's the question of knowledge and trust. Householders know very little about energy efficiency of their homes. Very few know star ratings, even if they are living in a new home. Retrofitting takes a lot of time. Decisions involve a varied collection of people, and very seldom are tradespersons considered when people make decisions, and there are power imbalances. So very often it's the man who makes financial and technical decisions in the home. Looking at the outcomes, well, there is the challenge of ensuring that after the retrofits or upgrades, there will be affordability. New appliances will cost money. So it's the heating system, the stove, the hot water. There may be structural changes where there needs to be an opening in a new wall. And really a lot of homes in Australia are too cold for comfort because only the living room is heated and bedrooms are cold, and that is a risk for mold. So if we do electrify, it should really have affordable warmth in all rooms. If people want to decommission gas, it's got those abandonment charges, can be over $1,000. And then there is tariff uncertainty because the tariffs change all the time. So just imagine gas becomes free from tomorrow onwards. How will people react? And then with the electrification, the energy grid needs to control demand. So we're going towards peak demand tariffs, but there are people who've got limited flexibility to use their appliances when prices are low or the solar panels generate electricity. Families in the afternoon, they need to cook, they need to wash the children, they need to go to bed, or people who are working in factories or cannot work from home, trades. There are smart appliances, so you can program the washing machine to run during the day, but again, those are more expensive. There are also challenges around retrofitting heat pumps, for example. So firstly, there's a disruption to the household. They can be quite noisy. So as we're going towards a denser environment, that poses problems. If they are located on a balcony, well, part of the balcony is not usable if it's running. And then when we look at reverse cycle air conditioning retrofits, which seem to be quite a popular alternative to wall gas heaters, finding the optimum position so the whole room is getting warm can be a challenge. If the room isn't insulated, that creates discomfort. So a little diagram shows that there is a 6-degree difference between the middle of the room and the outside. So you actually have a draft going. That air movement can irritate eyes. For example, if someone has got glaucoma and the filters need to be cleaned and very few people know about it and do it. And then there's this uncertainty that the bills are actually going to be lower. If people are underheating their home now, if there is a change to the home environment, to the technology, they will then now feel more confident in heating. They are heating more, longer, higher temperatures. Well, there can be a pre-bound effect if they were underheating, or a rebound effect if they're just more generous. And that can be a good challenge. And then there are concerns that the distribution of the benefits and burdens in this transition can be unequal. So for example, if we introduced gas bans for new homes or voluntary switches to all electric homes, some people may be at a triple disadvantage. And those are the ones who don't have the capability to retrofit, to electrify, or access subsidies. So people on a low income who cannot have a loan or don't want to have a loan, low wealth, they don't have financial reserves. People who lack the technical understanding or digital literacy to find information to apply for subsidies, all these decision-making informations are very often online, or they don't know how to operate the new heat pump. People like renters and apartment dwellers, they lack the agency to make any modifications. If you have a leaking roof, you know that poses problems as well. And there's a lot of trust, a lack of trust in information and services and tradespeople. And there are those households who are hard to reach. All of these people have got a pre-existing disadvantage, limited access to help and energy assistance, and then they carry the burden of cross-subsidization if those financial, the costs of the financial incentives are spread across the population. And these diagrams show how a utilitarian approach to subsidies, so anyone can access this, it's not means testers, may actually be regressive in this case for renters. So owner occupiers are 5 times as likely to have solar energy, for example, than renters, and areas with a higher share of rental dwellings were associated with less intensive fixed generation. So that's the Victorian Energy Upgrade Program. We did some analysis there. Also, if there are subsidies, often it is targeted at low-income households, and that may entrench disadvantage for low wealth households. So the diagram on the left, for example, shows solar panel uptake over various periods, and the inequity in wealth is higher than the inequity in income when it comes to solar panel intake. And that is because only around a third of low-income households are actually also low wealth. So they may have savings, they may own the home, they may have superannuation. So recommendations, energy efficiency first. So really, best saving is the energy not used that reduces the heating demand, hot water demand, for example, as well. It provides a better performance of heat pumps, makes homes more comfortable. So in that little diagram at the top, that is the same setup, but it's double glazed now, and the walls are insulated. But it also provides resilience to electricity price dynamics, and diverse voices need to be included. Those technological solutions often come from white males. So we need to hear women and marginalized groups. And also, if we need to limit gas bans or electrification mandates, if there is no support for equitable retrofitting of existing homes, there needs to be more householder engagement, awareness around what energy efficiency in the home actually means. What are those star ratings and the whole of home ratings? No one really knows. Continued funding. So if by the time people find out about a subsidy and they go there, it's still there and they can access it. Minimum rental housing standards offer protection for renters. Compliance needs to be ensured, and a more democratic approach to the distribution of subsidies, so that in the end, everyone is in a better place, is obviously favoured. So we've got targeted programs in the ACT in South Australia already, and means of wealth testing. And then when it comes to people who are hard to reach, to use local trusted intermediaries, and that's where we advocate for cross-portfolio approaches to work with housing, energy, health, and social services to come together for this transition. And that's where I will leave it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. And thank you so much for just, really grounding the conversation in the reality out there, particularly as it's faced by the most vulnerable in our community. There's an incredible amount of enthusiasm for electrification, but it's important to remember this is a complex challenge. We need to think through that complexity and make sure that we respond to it appropriately. And I'm sure I can see from the questions in the chat, we're going to be continuing to unpack that complexity over the next little while. But I will segue to our final speaker, Bruce Precious from Six Capitals Consulting. And Bruce, you've been doing a lot of work in this space from a lot of different angles. You had a key role in the ASBEC report we mentioned earlier, you joined the project team for the work that the Energy Efficiency Council and the Australian Alliance for Energy Productivity did on the report Harnessing Heat Pumps for Net Zero that released a couple of months ago. And I think you're just a massive nerd for heat pumps, quite frankly. So, you know, there's really no other reason that we need to lay out for you being here. Bruce, welcome. Keen to have you bring us home.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thanks for the invitation to present today. As Luke mentioned, having some role in both the ASBEC project and the EEC project on heat pumps has given me some insights into the electrification challenge. Now, potentially, I'll be Captain Obvious again, but the discussion that I'm hoping we have is one that I haven't heard more broadly across the built environment as yet. And today I want to speak particularly to the urgency of electrification policies to guide this part of the transition to net zero emissions. The data on this chart is drawn from the federal government's residential baseline study that was published late last year. And this shows that there's approximately out of the around 11 million homes in Australia, 2.9 million of them have a gas heating system. With these projections, which I assume are under sort of current policy settings or some sort of business as usual policy settings, that we would see gas heating decline somewhat, but still to see significant numbers, about 2.4 million gas heaters in use by 2040. If we take a look at the number of residential gas hot water systems, it's a different view, with around 5.2 million homes currently having gas hot water, with a business as usual increase up to more than 7 million by 2040. Now, clearly that's not compatible with a net zero future. So we need to look at electrification and at an electrification scenario. And I just want to weave a little bit of a story by taking an example residential street in an Australian suburb. So this is Progress Place. There's 100 homes in Progress Place. It's 2023, so current day, and 90% of these homes are connected to gas. So it's probably in a southern state. 1 in 4 of them have solar on the home, compared to an Australian average of closer to 1 in 3. So I'm lagging just a little bit. 10 homes, some solar, some not, don't have a gas connection. But the other 90 do. So if we think about those 100 homes and consider a scenario of electrification from here, here's some assumptions. We're starting with 90 out of 100 connected to gas. If there are 2 out of the 100 homes replaced each year, and I think that might be just a little bit above the national average, but 2 out of 100 homes being replaced each year, and let's, for the argument, let's say that the local council has mandated no new gas connections. That will mean 2 out of 100 homes being electrified each year. Solar penetration is expected to grow to 80 out of 100 homes by 2040, with all the solar homes converting to fully electric by 2030. So that's where when you're converting to solar, the penny drops that gas is really expensive compared to using the energy that's generated off your own roof. So that would, over that period, that means another 4 homes each year convert across to fully electric. And remember that solar penetration is what's included in AEMO's step change scenario, the 82% renewables by 2030 scenario. Gas appliances, especially hot water and heating systems, have a lifetime. I've estimated they're replaced on a 12.5-year cycle. That might be a little bit low, but I'm going to suggest that when somebody undergoes a major equipment upgrade on that 12.5-year cycle, that 1 in 4 of the homes upgrading a major piece of energy equipment choose to move across to electric either home heating or hot water systems. So that would average out at another 2 out of our 100 homes each year converting to electric on that basis. Now, there's going to be some other people that are just green aware homeowners. they'll be electrifying. It's a conversation that's growing around the communities already, and I'm going to group them in with the solar homes, so no extra allowance for greenies moving to fully electric. So if we accept that those scenarios are reasonable or close to reasonable, when we roll forward to 2025, 31 homes of the 100 now have solar. 26 homes are fully electric, up from 10 in 2023. So in that 2 years, 4 new homes have replaced old homes, and they're all electric. We've got 8 new solar, all electric homes, and 4 homes have changed over to fully electric on appliance changes, realizing that they could probably just get rid of the gas heater when it dies, because they already had a reverse cycle system that they could use to heat the home in winter anyway. So we roll forward to 2030 and we see significant change again. 46 out of the 100 homes now have solar, and 66 out of the 100 are fully electric in that time period, just to 2030. And of course, it doesn't take very long after that, that under those scenario settings, that by 2035, 100% of the homes are fully electric. And remember that the basis of this scenario is that we started with 90% of the homes connected to gas, 2 being rebuilt each year, 4 converting their solar houses to fully electric, and 2 converting to fully electric when the hot water service or heating system died. 8 per year, so all 90 gas homes are converted to fully electric in a little over 11 years. Now, we can argue about the numbers, but it's not going to be plus or minus many over this time period. Much of this progress to electrification is going to be driven through the ongoing take-up of solar. And as you take up solar, it doesn't make sense to have gas in your home. So but the important question here for the gas company is, at what point do you throw in the towel? The costs of maintenance and management of the gas network are being carried by a declining customer base. So is it at 50% that you roll over and say, well, we just can't afford to continue to maintain that gas network? Because in our scenario, that happens in 2028, 5 years away. Is it 75%? Because that would be in 2031. Anybody buying a gas stove, a gas oven, or hot water system or heating system is probably expecting right now it's going to last longer than 2028 or 2031. And how does the market respond when the closure of the gas system is forewarned? That would, to my mind, just accelerate the scenario that we just discussed. But before we move off this scenario, let's have a look at another street that's just down the road from Investor Drive. And from where we were in where were we? Progress Place, that's where we were. Let's go to a little street down the road, Investor Drive. There's 40 homes in this street, roughly, and that roughly equates to the 30% of total homes that are rented. Just 4 are fully electric in 2023. A couple of lucky tenants have solar, but well below the national average. Some small apartment buildings with a mix of retirees on fixed incomes and rentals. Let's fast forward from 2023 to 2030 to see what's changed in Investor Drive. And nothing has changed, except the gas company is decommissioning the gas network upstream because Progress Place customers have almost all transitioned off gas. There's a suite of policies needed that will support investment in better performing homes, not only to avoid stranding customers, but to enhance the comfort and livability of these same homes. We know we can build ecosystems that deliver change. The Neighbours ecosystem is a great example. The residential solar program and all of the policy elements around that program is another. Now we need an electrification ecosystem. The typical homeowner will draw on all of these features on moving to an all-electric home. They need sensible information on electrification, trades that are on the same page, appliance suppliers that don't try to talk them into a cheaper gas unit that they're trying to get rid of. rid of. Appliance suppliers that provide quality products supported by clear and consistent energy labelling. And we need the energy supply side, both gas and electric, to play ball, ease the way, not stand in the way. And we need to do this at scale rapidly. This ecosystem needs to exist for all 5 million homes over the next 10 years, not in a piecemeal basis. An efficient transition is best achieved by consistent policy, state to state and city to city. Meanwhile, vested interests will find the electrification transformation a difficult pill to swallow. They'll encourage consumers to buy appliances that may need to be retired early. They'll encourage new gas connections to gas networks for as long as they can. They'll mislead consumers about renewable gases. That's today's reality, to be avoided tomorrow if policy settings can be set right. Electrification policy settings are urgent to guide energy networks, to inform homeowners, building owners, and to support the transition of trades and to encourage supply chains with quality products, to ensure renters and low-income households aren't disadvantaged in the transition that is already underway. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Luke.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate that. And before we go to our panel, I am going to get you to unshare your screen, Bruce, when you've got a moment. And I'll just speak to some of the work that the EEC's released recently, which is helping with this agenda as well. We've released two reports in the last 6 months. The first, Bruce was on the project team for, as well as Alex St. John, Julianne Tice, our friends at A2EP, led by Jared Leake, Alan Pears, a absolute cavalcade of rolled gold experts in this space, harnessing heat pumps for net zero. This report looks at the emissions and energy savings associated with the transition to electrification, and actually included a significant piece of modelling work looking at the opportunity for electrification in residential buildings, commercial buildings, and in industry over different timescales to 2030 and indeed to 2050. It also unpacked some of the complexity in terms of, I guess, the policy that's available in each space, the current state of the technology. This webinar is very much focused on the building space, residential and commercial buildings. There's very different challenges that are faced in just those two sectors, despite the technology being relatively mature. In residential, much of the technology is available, but the skills and the supply chains, particularly, the familiarity of trades with heat pumps as a technology, particularly for water heating, is a long way from where we need it to be. Also, there's basic things missing, like minimum energy performance standards for hot water, heat pump hot water systems. So there's work to do in that space. In commercial buildings, different set of challenges for smaller commercial that already has decentralized heating solutions. The transition can be relatively straightforward. For large commercial buildings with centralised plant rooms, trickier, more complex, by all means achievable, but we've got a journey to go in terms of getting those very large commercial buildings retrofitted and accelerating the learning rate, because there's a lot of companies that want to be in that space, but they're not quite there yet, and there's not necessarily a lot of expertise that has been developed by learning by doing to enable that transition to pick up. There's a whole big chunk of work within that report on industrial, but there's another webinar we'll be doing within the next month to 6 weeks with our friends at A2EP that'll unpack that a little bit more. The second report, Clean Energy, Clean Demand, which we released last month, authored by the EEC's Head of Market Transformation, Rob Murray-Leach, actually went sector by sector and looked at the different decarbonisation options for different parts of the economy. It wasn't specifically focused on electrification, but in many cases it found that the evidence is strongly pointing to electrification as the least cost pathway, echoing a lot of the work that's been done by ASBEC and GBCA and so forth. This report specifically looks at the interaction between a renewable energy system or an electricity system that's rapidly barreling towards a high penetration of renewables, and what that means for how we electrify, and finds that, you know, the alignment of electric load with the availability of renewables is really important, but also that efficiency is really important. Turns out thermal performance of homes is an incredibly valuable grid resource, because as the sun goes down, as the availability of that solar generation on the system goes down, people come home to, you know, switch on their appliances. If you've got a good building that has decent thermal performance, you're putting less load on the grid, and you're managing the amount of money you need to spend on storage. So that's a really interesting piece of work that I commend to you as well. And no doubt Nat's been furiously dropping all of these reports into the show notes. No shortage of reading material for the electrification nerd, or indeed just the electrification curious out there. But with that, I will invite our panelists, Alison, Bruce, Davina, and Nicola, to flick on their displays, their microphones, and we'll get into the discussion. I think we need to start, because I don't know. Have you ever presented that little bit of back of the envelope analysis, Bruce, before? It's the first time I've seen it. That's hot from the old noggin, or have you been shopping that around?
That was a premiere presentation just for the Energy Efficiency Council. Luke.
There you go. I'm very honoured. I'm inclined, given that Bruce has just dropped that on us, to go around the horde and get the reactions of our esteemed panel to Bruce's analysis. Davina, do you want to kick us off?
Well, look, I always love seeing fresh analysis from Mr. Precious. I think the most useful part of that analysis is to actually say everyone's really good at talking about right now, and there's a lot of discussion about 2050, and unfortunately there hasn't been enough discussion about this middle period. And, you know, how steep is that curve and that incline? I think the things we've got to take out of this is we need to have policy and plans now, and then we actually need to work through the transition. You know, Nicola's points about how we work with the most vulnerable. I myself sit on the board of a social housing entity. So we've got to be really focused on, there's a part of the cohort that'll move really quickly, that, you know, some of the investable asset class with the right drivers, but we're going to have to pick up other pieces. So, you know, Bruce, I love this. This is slightly faster than I had anticipated, but I think the key point that you note that none of us can model is, you know, there's going to be a point where it's slow, and then a bunch of the dominoes are going to topple. You know, I know some of the questions we're going to unpack is how many of these do we do a week, a year, or this or that? There will become a point where the predominant appliances available are electric. So when people turn over their kitchen as usual, or their hot water system goes bang, this is a business as usual decision rather than a whole of house retrofit consideration. So, you know, but I do think it's really helpful to start mapping these as paradigms and seeing how people feel and how we're prepared, you know, for the most vulnerable cohort in our community, and be prepared to support our networks as they transition.
I think it's a really good point, Davina, and I think there's recent evidence for how quickly that can shift. And as some of you know, I was in Europe last year in June. I've spent a lot of time in Germany within 3 or 4 months of the war beginning in Ukraine, and just the perception shift in Europe, you know, with a big sort of external shock in the war in Ukraine, a shifted strategic imperative. But, you know, electrification had been on the roadmap for Europe, for many of those European countries, and the kind of the massive sentiment shift that's taken place in Europe over a very short period of time, and the ramp up in the heat pump market we've seen in Europe very, very quickly is something to note. It won't play out in the same way here, but there, as you say, there are these tipping points. The other thing that I reflect on is we're having this sort of conversation, and it's playing check, you know, hydrogen versus electrification and so forth. You know, for me, hydrogen, the ESC is very interested in efficient outcomes and delivering the energy services that end users need in the most appropriate way possible. And hydrogen, I think, will very likely play a role, particularly for high penetration process heat. The evidence that we looked at suggests it's unlikely to play a role in heating buildings. And I think, the evidence from, all the experts, on this call, as well as, the independent experts that look at it around the world, repeatedly come to that conclusion. We had a big debate in the last decade around, coal versus renewables, right? And it was a debate for a long time, and then suddenly it wasn't, and everyone agreed, well, yes, we're heading to high penetration renewable energy system, and the debate moved on to how we do it. So I think we're in the bit before everyone just comes to that conclusion, but we need to prepare for the point where we do, and because it is like the supply side transition. It's just as complex on the demand side is navigating that transition. But anyway, I said to go around the panel, and then I just immediately jumped in myself. I will my lips, and I'll go to Nicola, because I'm interested in your view on Bruce's presentation. Nicola.
I really liked it because it was very pretty and very clear, and it was good to see those years and how quickly that transition may happen. But I have to admit, I felt sorry for those people living in the black homes that weren't part of the story, and they were being left behind, and they were likely to carry an increase in infrastructure costs, because if there are only half of the houses left in the street that have got the gas connection, the infrastructure costs go up, are likely to go up for those who are left, and then they are doubly disadvantaged. So that was my thought on that.
Yeah, great. And thank you, Nicola. And Alison, anything further to add on Bruce's work?
Yes, I think one of the standouts for me was sometimes we have a lot of assumptions. So even AEMO's modelling assumes, say, that residential gas use has dropped significantly by 2040, but we don't yet have the policy mechanisms in place to make that happen. The simplest is, banning gas in new construction. That isn't happening nationally at the moment. So, we do have a way to go in a policy perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, one of the things that we thought we might talk about, and has indeed been running pretty hot in the chat, is, I guess, the debate that I flagged. Which is, the role of hydrogen in gas networks versus moving to electrification. This isn't, necessarily a simple transition, whatever pathway we go down. There's, likely to be electrifying implies some grid augmentation. There's new electric load that needs to be managed on the system. Bruce, I know, given that you've sort of been cutting across a bunch of these projects, what's your reaction or advice to those of us joining that are still kind of grappling with the various pathways that we have available to us, particularly as it relates to buildings?
Yeah, I think I would point those that are interested in the green hydrogen scenarios to take a look at the ASBEC work in particular, that look deeply into what that might look like. And the simple conclusion there is that green hydrogen will be a very expensive fuel source compared to green electricity, because you need so many units of green electricity to turn into the green hydrogen, still get it networked out to your home, and there is no resolution on what a 100% green hydrogen network might look like. And we're going to have to go and change every appliance, gas appliance, regardless. If we're going to change all the appliances, we might as well change them to electric and run them on the cheaper green electricity anyway. So there just wasn't a scenario, whichever way we painted it, where green hydrogen came out as being competitive in the built environment. Careful to qualify that as the built environment. That's the only sector we're looking at. And I guess we were encouraged that every other study that we could find from reputable sources overseas was coming to the same conclusion. And I know one of your speakers in the upcoming seminar, Luke, for those that are interested in that space, to hear from Jan Rosnow would be a really, really powerful thing to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. So at the National Energy Efficiency Conference taking place next week, we're very lucky to be joined by Jan Rosnow from the Regulatory Assistance Project. And among the many kind of pastimes that he's accumulated over the years, he's doing a rolling meta-analysis of independent studies. So these are studies not funded by, gas interests or heat pump interests or anyone with a vested interest in any particular transition pathway. Academics that are looking at this in a completely impartial way. And I think he's up to 36 studies so far that have found that the pathway for decarbonising heat in buildings is going to be electrification. And he's found 0 independent studies that suggest that hydrogen is the best pathway, specifically in buildings. And that is the great caveat that we always need to make. This isn't an anti-hydrogen argument. It's an argument for clarity in terms of the sector that we're talking about decarbonising at any point in time. And there's going to be different technology pathways for different industries, different parts of the economy, but that has important implications for the system, right? I think, there's a lot still to debate about what Australia's future energy system looks like, but it's much more likely that we're going to have hydrogen hubs where hydrogen is being created locally and there are hydrogen networks, but it's the industries are built around that, or the hydrogen is being piped around an existing industrial precinct rather than hydrogen running all around the country, because it's just incredibly, like you talk about the cost to generate hydrogen, it's also very expensive to transport. So anyway, Davina, Alison, Nicola, anything to add to into the great hydrogen debate?
I think I might just jump in and talk about the ASBEC modelling, in the sense that, our hydrogen scenario had so many favourable assumptions about hydrogen and still didn't prove to be as cost effective as electrification. So, it assumes that, there is going to be the technology in place for green hydrogen to be in buildings, but, waiting, nearly a decade to have technology that isn't yet proven, it's just a missed opportunity. And, the opportunity of cost of not acting now to take advantage of electrification is going to cost the economy in the long run. So again, a huge pointer that just for buildings, we should be looking at electrification and allow hydrogen for those harder to abate sectors and like you said, the industrial sectors.
Well, let's leave that one there, because we could do a whole webinar just on that topic. And
so, Luke, can I jump in? Because the flip side of setting aside the hydrogen network is can the electricity network cope?
That's where I was going, Bruce.
Thank you.
So I was going to say, there's a great question in the chat, and actually a couple of questions which is going, well, if we put the debate aside, it's likely that hydrogen isn't going to factor in this. It's going to be an electrification pathway. Can the grid cope? What about the connections from buildings into the grid? What is the augmentation task? Is that going to be, prohibitively expensive? Bruce, it sounds like you have opinions on that.
Well, I think to start with the recognition that it's not a one-for-one replacement. We use gas so poorly, which is something that is really well documented in the heat pump report. We use gas so poorly; it's so inefficient. For a boiler, most of the significant portion of the energy goes out the flue. Boilers in commercial buildings are used as a pretty blunt instrument to heat buildings, and we have poor control over the use of boilers in commercial buildings, for instance. And I would hazard to suggest that we have pretty poor control over gas heaters in homes, and lots of inefficiencies come along with those gas systems. When you replace a gas heating system with a heat pump, which might have a coefficient of performance of 3 or better, maybe 4, maybe better, then the amount of electricity we need to replace that gas consumption is a fraction of what we were using before in gas. So yes, there will be increased load on the electricity network. If it's for heating, then it's at a different time of the year when we have the peak cooling loads that we already have on the electricity network. So again, we're not necessarily adding all of that load onto the summer or the winter, the annual peak, whatever that condition is. So do we need to manage the transition of the electricity network? Absolutely, we need to, both from a reliability of renewables and capacity of the grid perspective, but they're things that we can manage.
Any other ores that any of you want to stick in on that particular topic?
Well, when we look at network capacity, we can almost get there on, electrifying buildings per se if we do good demand management and efficiency work at the same time. Where it gets really tricky is obviously EVs. That's what blows, the demand side out of the water, and that's where we've got to be focusing on, the important questions that people are putting in this. I was at a lunch with Minister Bowen earlier in the week where obviously we're going to have to be looking at increase on supply side. We're going to have to be looking at increase on storage side. Whichever way you look at it, we're already under a transition. The latest quarter of data is that we're at 37% renewables, which is a substantial change from where we were. So, I think this transition mentality is absolutely going to have to stay. And as we look at the EV transition, one of the biggest challenges we have in the market is not having fuel efficiency standards. And so we're going through an uncontrolled transmission to green, EVs. One of the things that was fascinating is, bizarrely, the Green Building Council started having great relationships with lots of car manufacturers because unusually, until about 18 months ago, Green Star, a voluntary rating tool, had probably rolled out more EV charging than government policy. Now, that is an anomaly compared to anywhere else globally, and that's something that we actually need to be clearer on, because that's actually going to drive a lot more of the supply side conversation than the electrification agenda.
Yes, and there's just some really fantastic comments, some spirited debate happening in both the chat and the questions. Our friend Alan making the point that a lot of ducted gas systems use quite a lot of electricity for the fans, which means there might be a little bit of headroom we can use there for other purposes. We've talked a lot about residential. Michael Snow from RMIT is reminding us that there is a whole big agenda here on commercial buildings as well, and there is the complexity there that I flagged that was picked up in the work that we did with A2EP, but Davina also in guide that your team produced, particularly on the retrofit side, simpler because you know what you're designing for, and one can get one's arms around that. But where you've got an existing building with a big centralized energy services need, there's complexity there, right?
That's where the technical challenge is. Like, let's be really clear, new buildings, this is really straightforward. Again, when we started talking about this 5-6 years ago in the climate positive pathways, it was really controversial. We had a whole bunch of studies at the time. Engineers were predicting it'd cost $1 million or more on buildings. Now, all feedback is that it costs the same, or it's actually less with the reticulated network if you allow space at the start. That's what's given New South Wales the confidence in their large building side. So it's a great shout out to talk about the large building side. That's what's given them the confidence to try to put through an electrification pathway in the sustainable building SEP that starts in September this year, end of September. That's what's giving ACT the confidence to go through their Electrify Everything campaign. And I think if we talk about the large end of town, Science Based Targets last night dropped for consultation their portfolio approach, which expects all electrified buildings 2025 for new buildings. So talking about things that might shift radically in the global discussion. You know, we're talking about gas heating bans in Germany. We've already got 2 jurisdictions in Australia that are talking about substantial transition at this time. It's going to be the dominoes that some of these things are going to happen slowly, really quickly.
I just want to try and get to as many of these questions as I can. There's a couple of questions I might bundle together, but I'm going to go to you, Nicola, because I think you'll be able to pick up both of these ideas on the way through. There's a question on business models, effectively, like how we make it easier for people to go on this journey, and particularly if you're a marginalised group, a vulnerable group, like obviously you've got the support that you need from government. Just engaging with the issue and knowing what to do is a big part of the agenda. We don't really have a sophisticated market for these sorts of services, particularly integrated services. And so one of the things we're thinking about the Energy Efficiency Council is, well, if you're electrifying your space heating, you really want to do your thermal performance upgrade before or at the same time. And they're different trades, they're different parts of the market, and there's not a lot of interest or incentive for kind of pulling those together. Indeed, in the programs that exist in places like Ireland, they won't actually give you the incentive to electrify your space heating unless you've done the thermal performance first, which is really interesting. But that's a question about business models. And also another question, Nicola, sort of picking up, you made a very compelling case for why it's crucial for us to engage with marginalised communities, with women, with voices that aren't necessarily being heard in these spaces. And there's a question around how we do that more effectively. Please, bundle your answer together or answer them in turn. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
So definitely energy efficiency first, because you can have a smaller heat pump. The heat pump won't switch on and off all the time. There are various heat pumps, and you really want something that sort of goes smoothly, like a car. I don't want to stop and start all the time. So definitely energy efficiency first, whatever you do, and even better, sufficiency. Using the space we have more effectively. How do we include marginalized voices? I think it's more consultation, being open. A lot of the energy that is being used in the house is still used by women. It's still mostly women who do the cooking and the washing and the drying. How often do you hear something about a lawnmower? Why don't you have a sheep rather than a fossil fuel lawnmower? So those discussions don't often come up, but women are seldom involved in these considerations, and when we talk to householders, and that needs to be done. And when it comes to cooking, for example, there are cultural differences in how they look at cooking, who cooks, how they cook, what kind of utensils. So there's lots of research overseas that looks at capacity building amongst all kinds of workers, sort of social service workers, home and community care workers. They're doing capacity training in schools. So, children learn about energy efficiency in homes and how important that is, but also, the health benefits. So really looking at it comprehensively, not just looking at outcomes in carbon emissions and affordability, but things like health as well. And then obviously to go to the system, providing employment opportunities, I think is really important as well. For women, for the unemployed. So if there is a transition, it can be an opportunity to change some of those sort of sticky things in the system. And many women don't want people knocking on their door and coming in, not tradesperson. They've had bad experiences with tradies who were trying to, pull wool over their eyes. They may even feel more comfortable with someone who they know, they trust. So place-based, having like-minded people, that will help as well.
I think that's a really good point, and it's a nice segue into a conversation around just the skills and capacity that we need in the market. And we're going to, this is very very significant task on the timescales that are being contemplated. Fixing, north of 8 million homes, whether you're talking about the thermal performance of the gas, and obviously those tasks are different in different parts of the country. And being about creating a welcoming industry for women and other marginalised groups, so they feel comfortable and able to join those ranks and have pathways to the sector is good from any number of reasons, including we can't afford to be exclusionary, right, in that journey. But as you say, it gives different types of cohorts a touch point, someone that they can relate to as they're getting advice and support through that journey. I might throw to the rest of the panel just on that broad topic of business models, skills development. This is a webinar that's taking on buildings broadly, and there's very different challenges in commercial buildings versus residential buildings. I'd welcome any of you jumping on whatever is exciting your interest on that topic.
Potentially from a residential point of view, the skills and ensuring that your tradie knows what options there are. Because if you think of your plumber, your hot water system breaks and you need to replace it. Your plumber may only be trained in replacing like for like, which is gas system with gas system. So there's a huge piece, as you mentioned, Luke, about upskilling our industry and ensuring that our tradies know what the next solution is. And there's a potential skills opportunity where you might be training your plumber and gas fitter, as they were collectively known as, to understand what their electrical options are, and potentially we're looking at aggregating trades or upskilling trades in certain scenarios. So I think that's a huge opportunity and we need to start acting now.
I think we've got to look at hearts and minds in this. I see a great question in the chat. I can see Sophia from My Efficient Electric Home Facebook page. If anyone on the policy space wants to give a grant to someone who, a cohort who has been doing amazing work on the awareness side, I'm a subscriber to that group, learn something every time I log in, and they have one of the most diverse cohorts, as they mention. City of Marybank is also putting out electrification awareness focused on women from diverse backgrounds. But I have a habit of talking about, the carrot, the stick and the tambourine. We've been talking about the policy responses. We've been talking about the voluntary space, which particularly helps move the investable market, particularly at the big end of town. But this tambourine piece that's referenced in the chat, we need the leading chefs out there talking about why the cooking's better. We talk about decisions made by women in the household, or the key person who cooks, often the health discussion. My husband, who does beautiful Indian cooking, we were having a debate about who made the better rotis. Then I told him the kids could get sick, and decision was made pretty quickly. So I think we have to look at, what energy wonks like myself get excited about. To Nicola's point, it's pretty different to the average Australian, and we need to be looking at a variety of channels. And I couldn't be any more excited that there's a Facebook page whose stats seem to grow by a couple of thousand a week every time I look at it.
I'll just throw in terms of that residential space. I think it's fair to say, and anyone can jump in and correct me if you've got a different view, that in terms of driving retrofits at the kind of scale we're talking about, there's no nation that's really cracked it, and it's just got a system humming along, and everyone's happy. There's challenges everywhere. One of the emerging models that I like is the one that exists in Ireland, which includes a really good energy performance certificate system by European standards, accredited assessors, a mix of loans, they're starting to activate the finance market, but also accredited providers. So folk that can actually go in, and these are companies that are accredited by the government to go in and do the upgrades, who actually have the role of, pulling together the different incentives and, finance and so forth, based on the individual circumstances of the household. And so they make it easy, because it's clear who you need to go and talk to work through that process. And every nation will come up with some different pathways. In Australia, we also have the energy efficiency schemes available to us as vehicles for that. But I think that we need to think about the schemes and the experience that they have from a consumer side of things, and they tend to lean into ad hoc upgrades versus an integrated, holistic approach, and how we make that journey, that customer journey, a more seamless one. I think is going to be really important, because all of these different upgrades we're talking about, they interact, and doing them in a piecemeal way has challenges. So I wanted to say that but we've got 10 minutes more in the webinar, and I'm inclined to almost, there's too many questions to answer. I'm assuming that you've all been kind of perusing them in the background. I want to give you, the four of you, the opportunity to pick a question that you have an answer to, that you want to throw in, because I could pick them at random, but if there's something that's really exercising your mind, I want to give you the opportunity to stick the oar in.
I'll jump in. Can I jump in on commercial buildings? Michael has posed a question around the technology challenges of heat pumps in commercial buildings, and without a doubt, there are challenges, space challenges, infrastructure challenges within the buildings, and the supply temperature set points that we've historically used for control of heating in buildings. I think we will go through a learning curve, and we will learn to adapt and adopt. The ASBEC reports, as we've said before, determined that the electrification path was the least cost, but not a no-cost option. And there will be some commercial buildings that find it harder than others, and we'll also find it hard in Class 2 apartment buildings, where the infrastructure will be challenged to accommodate both hot water systems, electric vehicles, the other topic we drew in, but also the increased load with cooking. Smarter appliances are going to play their role in talking amongst themselves over what needs to run now and what can be put off till later. But there will be challenges like that. The policies that we rapidly need to roll out need to provide the support for, so that the learning curve can be, we can start moving our way up the learning curve as soon as possible. Yeah. The other question I just want to answer, I'll cheat and address too, is a question about, should electrification promote the additionality of new renewable energy? Well, I see the paradigm as being around the other way. In the residential, across the residential system, it seems to me that solar is going to be the more significant driver of electrification of homes. So it's going to be the additional renewable energy that drives the electrification, and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Bruce. Nicola, is there a question that you want to address, or indeed a final comment that you'd like to make?
Yes, there was a question about my comment that I said, what if gas was free of charge? So no one has said it's going to be free of charge. I just put it in there as a thought experiment to just think through what that may mean, how people would react to that, and really to make a point that decision-making in households is quite complex. You may want to do the right thing for emissions, but maybe your priority is just with the costs. And I agree with Davina and Alison, who said health is really a priority of many householders, health of older people, health of children, and who they think they need to protect. And because the other thing around is that there's so much talk about tariffs all over the world. Whenever there is a disaster, governments step in and, provide subsidies or change tariffs. And I don't know how aware you are of what is happening in California at the moment, where it's household income that's supposed to set the tariff. So low-income households pay lower tariffs than high-income households. And so there's always something happening in that space. And what happens, in those cases, what happens if wealthy households decide to go off the grid? Then it's the grid infrastructure that is left, for those who can't change. So I just think sometimes to put in crazy ideas, it's worthwhile just to think through different scenarios.
Love the thought experiment. Thank you, Nicola. Alison, a final answer or a final comment?
Yeah, probably more just a broad comment that may address a few questions about what about this electrification agenda? We know that there's a lot of advertising for green gas. What about electrification? What I will say is that there is a significant role for governments to play, not only in policy settings, but in being leaders. So governments have the ability to say that, at least for their assets, their huge asset owners, if they create the demand for electrification of these assets, that's going to help prompt the supply chain. They're the market enablers. So if they're demanding electrification for their buildings, then hopefully the supply chains will respond, the skills will be needed, and gradually that hopefully will roll out to the rest of the nation.
A great point, and that's the story of neighbours, right? It's those minimum neighbours ratings that were required in government tenancies initially that created the enabling environment for commercial building disclosure a few years later. And Davina.
Fantastic. I'm going to club up a few questions that are asking about individual jurisdictional regulations and how complex it is. There's a basics question here. There's a how it relates to neighbours. There's a Victoria question. As we should have done all of this as a staged transition over about 10 years, maybe 15. This is a little bit like my 11-year-old who leaves his homework to the last night. We're in for a disorderly transition. So you can feel comfortable that those on the call are speaking to people in all of those jurisdictions. And, Basics, for example, has committed to continuously upgrade the renewables in the grid rate so that will start very quickly in the next short time period. Advocating for electrification discussions are happening across all jurisdictions, but I'm going to tell a very short story. The ACT electrification movement started with a project, Gin and Dairy, that we had the pleasure to work with, refusing to put gas in their development and applying for a legal change out of one project. And that led to a movement that started to, has culminated across many participants for the electrify everything. So it's a disorderly transition, but we're actually going to be stumbling over the issues one project at a time. So unfortunately, to answer those questions, this is what a disorderly transition looks like. And this is why we're going to have to work together.
Yeah, no, well said. The best time to start would have been 10 or 15 years ago. And the second best time is today. So let's get on with it. Hey, thank you for this incredible panel, Davina, Nicola, Alison, and Bruce. We're very lucky to have the benefit of your insights and expertise, and also all your work on this agenda. Because one of the reasons why we are at a point where we can get on with it is because of work of professionals like you that have been thinking deeply about this space and in a position to advise industry, advise government, work with people of goodwill to progress the agenda now that we have a window to do so. So thank you all for that. It has gotten a bit of a shout out over the course of today, but it would not be in line with my role as CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council if I was not to give a shout out to the events taking place in Sydney next week. The National Efficiency Scheme Summit is going to be thinking about the next phase for Australia's energy efficiency schemes. It's a summit, a working event, coming in and working with government. We're partnering with Victoria and New South Wales to put this event on and kind of think about electrification, issues around peak, the goals that efficiency schemes should have, given our energy system is transforming, and what we set them up to do in the late 2000s is not what we need them to do in 2025 and beyond. So it's going to be a super fun conversation. And then, of course, we know that we love it. The National Energy Efficiency Conference has a huge focus on this topic as it applies in the building sector. Incredibly exciting. We didn't get to it today. We thought we would, but the federal government making some very significant investments, about 1.3 billion in building energy performance through the CFC and their social housing. We're going to be hearing around that, but also, you know, the business models, the supply chains, the skills that we need to drive this transition, not just in the building space, but also looking across to the industrial side of things. And we have a incredible group of international experts spearheaded by Jan Rosenow, but many, many others that are also contributing to that conversation. Now, that brings us to a close. Thank you to the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. If you're a policymaker and you've got this golden ticket that I hear is going around for an extra special secret policymaker call, I guess you have that link. And we'll see you over there in a moment. For everyone else, thanks for being with us. And thanks for the robustness of the conversation, the great questions. We're all on this journey together. We're learning. None of us really know exactly how to do this, but by having these exchanges, sharing our thinking, our insights, and I'm no doubt hearing from some of you in the future. We'll work it out together. Until next time, I've been Luke Menzel. See you soon.